two dates sit quietly inside a mountain of paperwork, separated by a little more than 2 years. At first glance, they appear unrelated. One date belongs to a charitable organization associated with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The other belongs to a policy announcement issued by the United States Treasury Department. Most people would never think to place those dates side by side. Yet when examined together, they reveal a sequence of events that raises questions extending far beyond celebrity headlines, royal controversies, or social media debates. The first date is March 14, 2024. The second is April 23, 2026. Between those two moments lies a complicated story involving nonprofit governance, financial disclosures, regulatory oversight, public accountability, and a restructuring that occurred just months before federal authorities announced plans to tighten scrutiny of a specific nonprofit model. At the center of the discussion stands the Archewell organization, founded by Harry and Meghan after stepping away from official royal duties. Public attention surrounding Archewell has often focused on high-profile projects, media partnerships, and public appearances. Yet beneath those headlines exists another story, one told through tax filings, compliance documents, governance structures, and unanswered questions. One question in particular continues to attract attention. Who ultimately controls the charitable assets currently associated with the organization? The issue is not simply about the amount of money involved. Reports indicate that millions of dollars remain connected to Archewell's philanthropic activities. The larger concern is transparency. Critics argue that despite extensive public coverage, surprisingly little information exists regarding certain aspects of oversight, control, and organizational structure. To understand why those concerns emerged, it is necessary to examine a series of developments that unfolded over several years. The first area attracting scrutiny involves governance. Most large charitable organizations operate under boards composed of multiple independent members. These boards exist for a reason. Their role is not ceremonial. They provide oversight, establish accountability, review financial decisions, and serve as safeguards against conflicts of interest. Independent directors often bring outside perspectives and help ensure that no single individual exercises unchecked authority. Observers reviewing Archewell's governance structure noted that leadership responsibilities appeared concentrated among a small number of individuals closely connected to the founders themselves. Charity analysts have pointed out that such arrangements differ from governance models commonly seen within organizations managing significant charitable resources. The concern is straightforward. When independent oversight is limited, questions naturally arise regarding decision-making processes and accountability mechanisms. Those questions intensified as financial figures became public. According to available filings, Archewell reported raising millions of dollars during its operations. However, spending levels during certain periods exceeded incoming contributions by a substantial margin. Supporters describe this approach as a strategic use of reserves accumulated during earlier fundraising success. Critics interpreted the same figures differently, viewing them as evidence of declining donor enthusiasm and increased pressure on long-term sustainability. What makes the debate particularly interesting is that both sides often rely upon the same financial documents while reaching entirely different conclusions. One interpretation presents spending as intentional investment. The other views it as evidence of financial strain. The numbers themselves remain unchanged, only the interpretation varies. Another issue emerged regarding donation reporting. Media reports highlighted questions surrounding several $million that allegedly appeared in one reporting year rather than another. Representatives associated with the organization reportedly explained that the funds had been properly accounted for, though reflected within a different filing period. Accounting adjustments are not uncommon in nonprofit administration. Timing differences occasionally occur. Nevertheless, whenever significant sums appear to shift between reporting periods, observers tend to examine the circumstances carefully. This is especially true when organizations operate under intense public scrutiny. Questions regarding transparency gained additional momentum because of a separate issue involving audits. On federal tax forms, Organizations may indicate whether their financial statements undergo independent audit review. Such audits provide assurance that qualified outside professionals have examined financial records and assessed compliance procedures. Several watchdog organizations reportedly sought access to documentation supporting those audit representations. According to critics, repeated requests produced no publicly available response. The absence of publicly released audit documentation became a focal point for discussion. Supporters argued that private organizations are not necessarily obligated to respond to every external request. Critics countered that transparency becomes particularly important when an organization publicly represents itself as operating under independent financial review. Regardless of perspective, the unanswered requests contributed to growing debate. Then came a development that shifted attention away from past filings and toward future regulation. In late 2025, Archewell underwent a structural reorganization. Public announcements described the move as an expansion designed to enhance philanthropic flexibility and broaden charitable impact. The language emphasized growth, opportunity, and continued commitment to social causes. Yet some analysts focused less on the announcement itself and more on the specific organizational model adopted during the restructuring. Reports indicated that Archewell transitioned into a fiscal sponsorship arrangement. Fiscal sponsorships are legitimate nonprofit structures used throughout the charitable sector. They allow projects and initiatives to operate under the umbrella of an established, tax-exempt organization. Supporters argue that the model reduces administrative burdens and enables charitable work to proceed more efficiently. However, critics have long argued that fiscal sponsorships can sometimes reduce public visibility regarding control, oversight, and financial management. That debate existed for years. What made the timing remarkable was what happened next. Only months after Archewell adopted the new structure, federal officials announced plans to increase transparency requirements surrounding fiscal sponsorship arrangements. Suddenly, a restructuring that had attracted relatively limited attention became part of a much larger national conversation. The overlap between those events prompted renewed examination of earlier questions. Were the changes simply routine organizational adjustments? Or had they unintentionally placed the organization inside a regulatory spotlight that was rapidly growing brighter? The answer remains a matter of debate. What is undeniable is that the conversation had expanded beyond celebrity news. The story was no longer centered solely on Harry and Meghan. Instead, it had become a broader discussion about nonprofit governance, accountability, transparency, and the evolving rules that govern charitable organizations in the modern era. As scrutiny surrounding Archewell continued to grow, attention gradually shifted away from public personalities and towards something far less glamorous, but far more important: the paper trail. Headlines often focus on speeches, interviews, and public appearances, but regulators, watchdog organizations, and nonprofit analysts pay attention to different things. They focus on filings, compliance records, governance structures, financial disclosures, and patterns that emerge over time. When those records are placed side by side, a more detailed picture begins to emerge. For years, Archewell occupied a unique position. Unlike many traditional charities that operate quietly outside public view, the organization was connected to two of the most recognizable public figures in the world. Every announcement attracted attention. Every initiative generated headlines. Every financial disclosure was examined more closely than it might have been for an ordinary nonprofit. That level of visibility created both opportunities and challenges. Supporters argued that the organization's profile allowed it to attract resources and awareness for important causes. Critics argued that celebrity attention sometimes distracted from questions that would normally be asked of any nonprofit managing substantial funds. One of the most significant areas of concern involved financial sustainability. During its early years, Archewell benefited from strong fundraising performance. Large contributions helped establish a significant reserve of assets, creating the impression of a well-funded and ambitious organization. Initial figures appeared impressive, generating optimism about the foundation's ability to support long-term charitable initiatives. However, later filings showed a noticeable decline in incoming donations. The contrast between the early fundraising period and subsequent years became impossible to ignore. Observers reviewing the numbers noted that contributions fell considerably from initial highs. While many organizations experience fluctuations in donor activity, the decline prompted questions regarding future funding strategies. Financial reserves can provide stability during periods of reduced income. In fact, many nonprofits intentionally build reserves for that exact purpose. The challenge arises when expenditures consistently exceed incoming revenue over extended periods. Supporters maintain that spending reserves was part of a deliberate plan designed to maximize charitable impact rather than accumulate unused funds. Critics interpreted the same figures differently. To them, the spending pattern suggested increasing reliance on assets accumulated during earlier fundraising success, rather than sustainable ongoing support. Both perspectives relied upon publicly available data, yet the conclusions drawn from that data varied dramatically. Questions regarding financial management intensified because of another issue involving reporting timelines. Reports circulated regarding several $1 million that appeared in one tax filing rather than another. According to explanations associated with the organization, the funds had not disappeared. Instead, they were reportedly recognized during a different reporting period. Accounting professionals understand that timing differences sometimes occur for legitimate reasons. Donations may be pledged in one year and received in another. Reporting schedules can vary. Administrative processes occasionally create delays. Yet significant discrepancies naturally attract attention. The reason is simple. Transparency depends not only on accuracy, but also on clarity. When large financial figures appear to move between reporting periods, observers often seek detailed explanations. Even when no wrongdoing exists, uncertainty can undermine public confidence. The issue became particularly important because confidence represents one of the most valuable assets any charitable organization possesses. Donors contribute because they trust an organization to manage resources responsibly. Beneficiaries depend upon that trust. Public credibility often determines whether future fundraising efforts succeed or fail. Against that backdrop, another controversy emerged. This time, the focus centered on independent audits. Independent audits play a crucial role in nonprofit governance. They provide external verification that financial statements fairly represent organizational activities. Auditors review records, evaluate controls, and assess compliance with accounting standards. When organizations indicate on federal filings that independent audits have been conducted, many observers expect supporting documentation to be available if requested. According to reports, several inquiries seeking access to Archewell's audit documentation reportedly went unanswered over an extended period. The lack of response became a source of frustration for some nonprofit watchdog groups. Their concern was not necessarily proof of wrongdoing. Rather, it involved transparency. In the nonprofit world, transparency often serves as a preventive measure. Open disclosure helps build trust and reduces speculation. When requested information remains unavailable, questions tend to multiply. Supporters of the organization argued that external requests do not automatically create obligations for disclosure. Critics countered that organizations benefiting from public support should embrace opportunities to demonstrate accountability. The disagreement highlighted a broader debate affecting the entire nonprofit sector. How much transparency is enough? At what point does privacy become secrecy? And how should organizations balance operational independence with public accountability? Those questions became even more relevant as Archewell entered a new phase of organizational development. Toward the end of 2025, the foundation announced significant structural changes. Public communications described the transition as an evolution designed to enhance philanthropic effectiveness. The messaging emphasized growth, adaptability, and expanded opportunities for charitable engagement. Yet analysts examining the details focused on something different. The restructuring involved a fiscal sponsorship arrangement. Fiscal sponsorships are not unusual. Thousands of charitable projects operate successfully under such models. In many cases, Fiscal sponsorships reduce administrative complexity and allow organizations to focus on mission-related work rather than regulatory compliance. However, the model also introduces additional layers between projects and the public. Depending on the structure, outside observers may find it more difficult to determine exactly how responsibilities are divided, who exercises authority, and where certain decisions originate. For years, nonprofit experts debated whether fiscal sponsorships required stronger disclosure requirements. Then federal regulators entered the conversation. In April 2026, the Treasury Department announced plans aimed at increasing transparency within fiscal sponsorship arrangements. The announcement immediately attracted attention across the nonprofit sector. Organizations operating under fiscal sponsorship models suddenly faced the prospect of expanded reporting obligations and increased scrutiny regarding governance and financial control. For Archewell, the timing proved impossible to ignore. Only months separated the restructuring from the federal announcement. Whether the overlap was coincidental or merely unfortunate timing became a matter of public debate. What mattered more was the broader implication. A structure once viewed as an administrative choice was now being discussed within the context of national regulatory reform. Questions that had previously remained confined to nonprofit specialists suddenly reached wider audiences. Who controls charitable funds? Who makes decisions? How transparent should those arrangements be? And what information should be publicly disclosed? As these discussions intensified, Archewell found itself at the center of a conversation extending far beyond celebrity philanthropy. The organization had become a case study in modern nonprofit governance, transparency expectations, and regulatory evolution. What began as a discussion about one foundation was gradually becoming something much larger, a debate about the future rules governing charitable organizations across the United States. And that broader debate would soon introduce an even more significant question. What happens when changing laws collide with structures created under older rules? The most fascinating aspect of the Archewell story is not any single controversy, financial figure, or public criticism. It is the way multiple developments, spread across several years, appear to converge at exactly the same moment. Separately, each issue might seem manageable. Together, they create a pattern that continues attracting attention from analysts, nonprofit observers, and regulatory experts. By 2026, the discussion surrounding Archewell had evolved beyond celebrity culture entirely. What started as a conversation about a foundation associated with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had transformed into a broader examination of transparency, governance, and accountability within the nonprofit sector itself. The reason is simple. Regulators rarely focus on personalities. They focus on systems. They examine reporting practices, organizational structures, compliance histories, governance models, and financial disclosures. While public debates often revolve around motives, regulators are generally more interested in documentation. They look for patterns, not headlines. When viewed through that lens, several developments connected to Archewell become particularly noteworthy. One issue involves organizational oversight. Most nonprofit governance models are intentionally designed to distribute authority across multiple individuals. Independent board members provide checks and balances. They ask difficult questions, challenge assumptions, and create accountability mechanisms that help protect both the organization and the public. The effectiveness of a board is often measured not by how frequently it agrees with leadership, but by its ability to exercise independent judgment. Critics, reviewing Archewell's governance structure, have argued that greater independence could strengthen confidence in decision-making processes. Supporters respond that founders often maintain significant influence within charitable organizations, and that concentrated leadership is not necessarily unusual. The debate itself reflects a larger question facing many nonprofits. How much founder control is appropriate? There is no universal answer. However, governance experts generally agree that independent oversight becomes increasingly important as organizations grow larger and manage more substantial resources. Financial reporting has generated similar discussions. Over several years, Filings revealed fluctuations in fundraising, expenditures, and reserve usage. None of those developments automatically indicate misconduct. Nonprofits frequently experience changing donor patterns. Economic conditions affect contributions. Strategic initiatives may require periods of elevated spending. Yet sustained discrepancies between income and expenditures naturally attract attention. Observers reviewing Archewell's filings noted that explanations provided by organizational representatives often differed significantly from interpretations offered by outside watchdog groups. One side emphasized strategic investment, the other emphasized financial decline. Both relied on the same numbers. That difference highlights an important reality about nonprofit accountability. Data alone rarely tells the entire story. Context matters. Interpretation matters. Communication matters. When organizations fail to explain financial decisions clearly, others often fill the information gap with their own conclusions. Another recurring issue involved audit transparency. Independent audits serve an important purpose within nonprofit operations. They help reassure donors, regulators, and stakeholders that financial records have undergone external review. Reports indicating that requested audit documentation remained unavailable generated considerable discussion. The issue was not necessarily whether an audit existed. Rather, it was the perception created by the absence of publicly accessible supporting information. Perception matters. In the nonprofit world, trust functions as a form of currency. Organizations depend upon public confidence to attract donors, establish partnerships, and achieve their missions. Even when no wrongdoing occurs, unresolved questions can create reputational challenges. For Archewell, those questions accumulated over time. Then came the restructuring. The decision to transition into a fiscal sponsorship model may ultimately become the most significant development in the entire story. At the time, the move was presented as a strategic evolution designed to support future philanthropic efforts. Such arrangements are widely used throughout the nonprofit sector and often provide legitimate administrative advantages. However, fiscal sponsorships have also attracted increasing scrutiny from policymakers. Critics argue that certain structures can make it difficult for the public to determine who controls funds, who exercises authority, and how decisions are made. Supporters counter that fiscal sponsorships often improve efficiency and allow charitable initiatives to focus on mission-related work rather than administrative burdens. The debate remained largely confined to nonprofit specialists for years. Then federal regulators changed the conversation. In April 2026, Treasury officials announced plans to strengthen transparency requirements related to fiscal sponsorship arrangements. The proposal reflected growing concern that existing reporting frameworks did not always provide sufficient visibility into organizational control and financial management. The timing immediately attracted attention. Archewell had adopted a fiscal sponsorship structure only months earlier. That coincidence became the centerpiece of numerous discussions. Some observers viewed it as unfortunate timing. Others considered it evidence of broader trends affecting the nonprofit sector. Regardless of interpretation, the overlap placed Archewell at the center of a rapidly evolving regulatory environment. Questions that once seemed technical suddenly became highly relevant. Who controls charitable assets? Who bears legal responsibility? How much information should be publicly disclosed? What obligations do fiscal sponsors have regarding transparency? These questions extend far beyond any single organization. In fact, they represent challenges facing the entire nonprofit sector as regulators attempt to modernize oversight mechanisms for increasingly complex organizational structures. Another factor contributing to ongoing scrutiny involves compliance history. Reports referencing registration issues and administrative filings added further complexity to the conversation. While compliance problems can often be corrected through routine procedures, repeated issues tend to attract greater attention from regulators. The reason is straightforward. Regulatory agencies often focus less on isolated mistakes and more on recurring patterns. One missed deadline may be accidental. Repeated lapses raise different questions. Again, this does not automatically indicate misconduct. However, it does increase the likelihood of additional scrutiny. When governance concerns, audit questions, financial fluctuations, restructuring decisions, and compliance issues appear within the same narrative, observers naturally examine the overall picture rather than individual events. That broader perspective explains why Archewell continues attracting attention despite the absence of dramatic legal action or formal accusations. The story is ultimately about transparency. Not guilt, not innocence. Transparency. Public filings tell part of the story. Press releases tell another part. Regulatory announcements provide additional context. The challenge lies in determining how those pieces fit together. As lawmakers consider new legislation and regulators refine reporting requirements, organizations across the nonprofit sector may soon face higher expectations regarding disclosure and accountability. If those changes occur, Archewell's experience could become an important case study. Future observers may look back on this period not as a controversy involving famous individuals, but as an example of how nonprofit governance standards evolve during a time of increasing public scrutiny. For now, many questions remain unanswered. The available documents provide clues but not definitive conclusions. What they reveal, however, is unmistakable. The conversation has moved far beyond celebrity headlines. It has become a discussion about how charitable organizations are governed, how transparency is measured, and how public trust is maintained in an era where accountability matters more than ever. And regardless of where the debate ultimately leads, that larger discussion is far from over.